Hello and welcome back to the Middling Along podcast. I'm your host, Emma Thomas, and today's guest is Paula Rastrick, creator of the Brain-Body Method, an integrated trauma-informed approach to menopause for highly sensitive women. Welcome to the podcast, Paula.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So you have had a fairly sort of convoluted journey to get to the work that you're doing now. So before we talk about that, can you sort of unpack a bit of that for us? You actually started working in human resources originally before your first sort of big pivot.
So originally, I've had quite a diverse kind of portfolio of career. I started off, in the old days, shall we call, in human resources in London. I've always been somebody that's been interested in personal development and people. And that role was really sort of pivotal to me in terms of business. And then I then met my husband. I was living in London and he was living in Birmingham. And so we sort of got together. And so I left London and I got pregnant and I had my little boy, our little boy. And shortly after that, I suffered from quite severe postnatal depression. So I, at the time, didn't understand any of the links to what I now know, but I decided to take a career break and decided to take some time out, and which I did, and then embarked on taking more of a yoga journey. So I started to get very into yoga. So that was kind of, then I decided to train in yoga, and that took me on another kind of, personal development kind of trajectory, really. And then I looked at the combination of yoga, the body and the mind, as we do when you kind of go on that journey. And one of the areas I really kind of excelled at was philosophy. So I kind of like academically was, that was the bit I was interested in, not the actual physical side. It was more around the embodiment of yoga. So this area became quite fascinating to me. And then just by coincidence, chance, really, my husband worked in a football club. He worked at Aston Villa Football Club. And he came home one day and he said to me, oh, the sports science guy, first team guy, Jim, he's talking about yoga. Now, this was way before yoga became mainstream in sport at all. It was just not in. So he said, do you fancy a chat with him? And I thought, well, do you know what? Yeah, okay. So anyway, I went into a football club and I spoke to this guy and he said, oh, look, can you start with the young lads? And I was like, yeah, no problem. Anyway, so it took me on a new career path in sports science. So then in a nutshell, that grew and grew and grew. And at the time, there was only myself and Manchester United. There was a lady called Sarah Ramsden at Manchester United, and she and her were the only women bringing kind of that yoga into sport. Anyway, as that grew, I then decided to embark on taking a further degree. So I did a degree in sport and exercise psychology. And then I started implementing pain science. And then so as I'm going along, I'm sort of, then I'm employed full time at the club. And that was really interesting. Obviously, a very challenging environment as a woman. I'm not going to lie. There were no women in sports science when I was in sports science. But I started to really hone in on what I'm going to call the kind of brain-body connection. So a bit ahead of my time in some ways. And I think one of the reasons for that was purely because my dad died of motor neurons disease. And then my granddad died of motor neurons disease. And so we were like, well, there's a hereditary, so I became fascinated with this kind of brain and the body and the communication between the two, and then got very heavily involved in pain science and why players were getting injured. And when they got injured, why did they get re-injured? It's not just a physical thing. And this was years ago, so it wasn't like, recent. And that kind of then evolved and evolved. So that's kind of where it started, really, into this investigation into the brain and the body and the communication pathways and how we're not just, that we can't separate the physical, the psychology and the biology. You just can't separate it, okay? And again, working through complex pain cases and injuries and performance, this kind of just became my thing, really. And then I got to the point in professional football where I always said, I'm never going to sell my soul. And unfortunately, some things were happening within the football environment that I felt were not ethically right. And I made a stand against that. I have a history of taking on causes, and then it's kind of like, it's kind of just who I am as a person, you know. I'm just like, and that comes probably from my childhood. So went through a very lengthy, horrible kind of process with the football club, and then left and set up a business with my husband. And then that's really when things started to unravel, and it took me to sort of running a business with my husband, and I started to feel not well physically, mentally. Now, I've always been what I'm going to call a high functioning stress head, really, if I'm honest. You know, I'm highly functioning, you know, and I noticed an advert on Facebook, and it said, "Are you drowning?" And I thought to myself, well, yes, I am. And it said, if you're 45, this was in 2017. So it said, if you're 45, this could be perimenopause. And what I want people to understand is in 2017, we weren't at the stage that we're at now.
The awareness just wasn't there at all, was it?
Pre any awareness. So
pre-Davina.
Pre-Davina.
A long way.
Yeah.
Kind of the pre and post Davina on the timeline.
Yeah. And that is so true. So it said, you know, you could be perimenopausal. I'm going to be completely honest. I was running a business. My life was unraveling. My marriage was in bits. I was struggling and I was drowning, and I was trying to keep my head above water. And I've always done that. So I just thought, you know what, maybe that's the answer. So I went to see a private menopause doctor who lived locally to me, filled in a form, which is like 21 symptoms. I think it's 21. And then sort of sat in front of her, and she said, "Oh, you're perimenopausal." And quite frankly, I was like, "Look, I don't care what I am. I need to survive. I'm running a business, and I just need to keep going." That was my attitude, right? So, yeah, no problem. HRT will solve this. I just thought, right, fine. Now, at this time, I didn't realize I was placed on what would be called a high dose. Now, a high dose is, so it was 200, right? So, you know.
And normally you would expect to sort of start low and work up if that wasn't dealing with symptoms.
Yeah, I've had this contentious point with my many interactions with trying to seek answers. You know, why start me on such high levels? Why not start me lower? You know? So anyway, I didn't at the time. I just said, fine. So off I went. It's a very long story, but the process was then one of unravelling mentally. So unravelling mentally, but still not recognising that actually, as my mental health deteriorated and I am still trying to keep going, I also didn't have my progesterone matched. So I started to bleed, and then I started to flood, and so this whole process went on for many months, which sounds ridiculous thinking when why didn't you? But I just was literally in survival mode, and I just thought, oh, it'll get better. So anyway, then my GP called me in because I tried to put in a prescription for my HRT. And they called me in and they just basically said to me, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And they were like, "Why are you on all this medication?" And I said, "Well, I thought that was, they said, well, we didn't know about it because the letters had been sent to the wrong doctor and stuff." Anyway, by this point, I was in a bit of a crisis. And I'd ended up leaving my husband. I left my son. I ended up in a very, very bad way. So mentally, I won't go into that part, but mentally. So then I started the process of having to go through cancer checks and all of this stuff because of the unopposed progesterone. And then they started saying to me, the gynecologists, "You're on too much HRT." And I was like, "No." And they were like, "Well, this is ridiculous." And so then this process started. So at the time, I just needed to get well. Now, then what happened was COVID came along. And as COVID came along, it stopped the world, didn't it? So everyone stopped. Remember that first lockdown?
It feels like a dream, doesn't it? That it really happened.
Surreal, doesn't it? It feels surreal. Even though I'm trying to recall like what was the timeline. Anyway, so as COVID came along, it stopped the world. And with that, I stopped. So I had this opportunity to just stop.
So you really just sort of stepped out of that.
Yeah, stepped out.
That drowning and not waving.
Exactly that. So my business closed for a start, which then took the pressure off that, because I wasn't having to, it was a public facing business and I was struggling. So, and then they put me on antidepressants to try to take me down off the estrogen because I was unstable, right? And I still didn't understand this. I just thought I need to be well. So once I went through this process, which took a long time, about a year or so of doing that, COVID was still in play, wasn't it? So I was then getting the opportunity to start to think to myself, this doesn't feel right to me. Like, why did I end up like this? What's happened to me? So I retracted my medical records and started to look at them. Then I was told the estrogen was far too high. So I thought, well, but other people might be taking this. Why me? Why me? And then that is what started my investigations over the last few years of piecing together through the research, joining dots to my childhood trauma. I have a very complex trauma background. Then discovering I was highly sensitive. Now, being a highly sensitive person is a genetic trait.
Yeah, can you get into detail with this? Because I think it's probably something that people might think they understand, but don't really. So they might be thinking, "Oh, I'm quite a sensitive person," but this is a very specific.
This is a science-based, So I have really, really, really delved deep. That's part of being highly sensitive as well. Your brain is different. So the one thing I will make clear is that highly sensitive, if we look at the work of Elaine Aron, who started the research, there is now quite a lot of body of research on what is classed as the highly sensitive person. And the highly sensitive person, we're all born with a level of sensitivity, right? But some of us come into the world with different genes that can make us more sensitive. And some people argue that sensitive isn't a great word. Some people say it's responsive, right? So the scientific term for this is sensory processing sensitivity, right? And what it basically means in a nutshell is that you have 1 in 3 have more sensitivity. We come into the world with more sensitivity of the brain and nervous system, and it's thought to be really more, if we go along the lines of neurodiversity, which we're seeing more of now, right? So you'll see more people talking about ADHD, but we're not talking about highly sensitive. And I think there's some comorbidities in these diagnoses, okay? One of the common themes that we can share is what's called sensory sensitivity. Okay, so sensory overwhelm, sensory overload, right? So this is where it gets a little bit complex, because being a highly sensitive person is not classified as a disorder. It's classified as a personality trait. You come into the world, right? Now, if you come into the world with more sensitivity of your brain and nervous system, you have more depth of processing. You have what's called over-arousal, overstimulation. So you are more easily overstimulated, more easily overwhelmed, more easily over-aroused. You also have emotional processing that's deeper. So when people say, you're being sensitive, you might be because you are processing emotions on a far deeper level. So my husband and I, for example, are not the same, right? So emotional processing, and some people will say that's what you would class as emotional empathy, where you can sense other people's pain, or so the depth of it can be quite overstimulating, really. So, and then you've got sensory sensitivity. So that's where your senses are taking in far more from your environment. So, for example, I'm the type of person, I didn't know at the time, that would be able to read a room. So if I went into a room and there was people in there, I'd be able to spot the subtle differences between that person's facial expressions and how they're feeling, and picking up little subtle differences and patterns that other people wouldn't notice. Now, they think it's probably come from, and I agree with this, is a biological trait. It's a primitive survival strategy. If you think about how we all come into the world, our brains have evolved. So there would have been a need for the highly sensitive brain, because we would have been the ones sensing danger, sensing.
And is there a difference in the rates of occurrence in men versus women?
No. So there's
Okay.
no difference between men and women, which is really interesting. There's differences in the spectrum of sensitivity. So the way that the researchers are now classifying it is they've tried to split it into highly sensitive. So you're talking about high sensitive being orchids. Then they've tried to put it into flower names, middle, medium, then you've got tulips, and then you've got dandelions. So they're trying to, it's a spectrum, but I really believe, because everybody's brain is completely unique anyway, I believe we always had this. It's always been there. It's not something that's just, I think ADHD and all of this neurodiversity has always been part of the human experience, because I don't know where we ever got to the point that we were saying, well, this brain is normal, because how would you know what brain is normal versus which one? Because every brain is unique. That's kind of where I...
And how does then your experiences in early childhood or later childhood, how does that then kind of moderate or correlate to,
So if you come into the world with more sensitivity, okay, so we'll just call it sensitivity for the sake of this. If you then have a childhood environment that is not safe, you can imagine that sensitivity, because the brain is changing when you're
high alert.
You're on high alert. So what exactly? So hypervigilance, hyperarousal. So for me, my example is, I believe I was born sensitive. I was brought into a world that was not safe. I had no attachment bond to my mum. Now, this is really important, because attachment and the nervous system and the brain develop from that childhood attachment. So I'm going to use me as an example. I never realized that at the time, but your nervous system starts to mirror and co-regulate with your key caregiver. So say my mum was not well, right? And she wasn't. And she hasn't got the capacity. She hasn't got the container to give me safety as a baby. My nervous system, before I can even think, speak, my nervous system is already adapting to that, because that's how the nervous system works. So we're talking now the language of the nervous system. So as I develop and I'm in a chaotic environment, I then go through multiple complex, I'm going to be talking about this more, but sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. So that then potentially increases my sensitivity, because we know that people with higher levels of sensitivity, we take on deeper experiences. Everything's more deep. So your menopause experience and your sensitivity of your brain and your body is potentially
It's like you've been primed for kind of greater depth of everything.
Greater, you exactly that. So a greater depth, and the way Elaine Aron and the research says is about the acronym of DOES. So depth of processing, over arousal, over stimulation, empathy. You have mirror neurons. We have different brain areas. The limbic system is more sensitive. That's the fear response, right? So you've got all of your emotional parts of your brain. The insula is different. We are more sensitive. Now, I didn't realize any of this. And then trauma rewires the brain. We're talking childhood trauma, right? Complex PTSD rewires the brain. There's this, it's coming from the brain and the nervous system. So say, for example, then I've had lots and lots of experiences. So when we're growing up, I think we're the generation, I was talking to someone earlier, I'm going to call us the sandwich generation. I think my parents didn't understand any of this. None. Trauma, nothing, okay? Because their parents didn't. We are in this generation, I think, where we're starting to understand more, but we're still at that point where we probably grew up, not all of us, but a lot of us grew up with repression. We just repress those emotions. We repress those feelings. We repress it because we stuff it down. And what we now know from the trauma research is that trauma doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't evaporate. It goes down, it's in your nervous system. It's held. There's a bit more science around memories and implicit memories and stuff, but I'll try to keep it simple. So any type of trauma hasn't just gone unless it's been metabolized and processed, right? Which is now why we're now looking more at the nervous system. So we're now understanding more about the nervous system. So if I then say to you, right, well, we get to perimenopause and the hormone fluctuations start, you've got estrogen receptors and progesterone receptors. I'm going to highlight the progesterone, right? Because they are neuromodulators of the brain and the nervous system. And so as they start to fluctuate, and progesterone goes first, not estrogen. Estrogen gets an awful lot of coverage, right? But progesterone, I've been looking at the research on this, and it's limited, but it's there. Progesterone plays a key role as a neuromodulator because one's an excitatory type of hormone and one's an inhibitor.
So if they're out of balance.
So I'll give you my example then. I'm highly sensitive. I'm already at the point of burnout. I'm at the point of my body is stuffed down. Yeah, as I arrive, then my hormones are fluctuating. So the last thing I needed was high doses of estrogen because that's put me into overstimulation. I'm already sensitive. Then I didn't get progesterone. So progesterone and estrogen counteract each other. And I'm not talking about progestin. Because again, I think there's a little bit of confusion. I don't know if that would make sense to you, that we've got progestin and we're not kind of understanding the difference between synthetic progestin and the body's natural progesterone. There seems to be... So progesterone and estrogen work in the brain along with testosterone, okay? And I was given testosterone as well with low progesterone. And testosterone aromatizes into estrogen. So now can you see why it's potentially quite overwhelming for a sensitive brain and nervous system to be started on such high doses of medication? And if we look at the research in Elaine Aron's work, she talks about how the sensitive body and the sensitive brain is very sensitive to medication. So I've joined the dots with that with hormone replacement therapy, because titration of doses in the brain is really, really key for women who have more sensitive brains and nervous systems.
And because not everyone reacts in the same way to the same dose or even the same method of delivery.
And titration is really key, right? Because if you think about the neurochemistry in the brain, HRT is psychoactive, okay? It's a psychoactive medication. You know, I know that we talk about it being, we're just replacing our hormones. And if you take we know the kind of body identical, yeah. But if you've been given what's called supraphysiological doses, that's more than what your brain and body would have been producing and dealing with. Now you're in overload, overstimulation. And I think what we're missing is actually the nervous system understanding. Because if I was to liken the nervous system to the engine of the car, the nervous system branches off into every single other system within the body, and all systems are connected. So we need to look at it from How's your brain? What's your individual brain? How is that reacting? Your nervous system. And for those of us that have had trauma, then repressed trauma is going to pop back up, unfortunately, when those hormones fluctuate. And I think that's what's happening. That little gateway, that little bit of vulnerability where those hormones fluctuate. And women that have had a comprehensive or any kind of trauma, it's almost like it's coming back up to the surface. And I don't think people are realizing that. And we're trying to stuff it back down again. And that's how now women are saying, but my symptoms aren't getting any better, or I'm still struggling, or I'm taking HRT, but I still have anxiety, or it might not be anxiety. If you've got a centralized nervous system that's more sensitive, it's over arousal. Does that make sense?
So how do we approach it then?
Yeah.
Because obviously already we've got a sort of a system, certainly in the UK, where if you're lucky, you get 10 minutes and maybe you get your HRT. There's not that kind of, there's no route in to do any kind of complex.
It's not trauma informed, is it, for a start? So this is one of my missions, okay? So being trauma informed is about medical and healthcare understanding that trauma has a major role in menopause. In my opinion, we've got limited research, but we've got research, right? We've got so much extensive research on adverse childhood experiences and health. So why are we not taking that across to the menopause transition? It's almost like in the menopause world, we're only looking at it from one small little lens at the moment. And that's brilliant because we need to raise awareness, but we need to now widen that lens. And the biopsychosocial factors are huge, aren't they? Like health is not management of disease. We know that now. We're looking at everyone's mental, physical, your social. I mean, as human beings, we're wired. The nervous system has a system called the social engagement system, which is around when you're connected. You're around people that make you feel safe, right? That has a direct relationship to your nervous system. And I think in some ways, COVID has almost got something to answer for as well, because I think some people have become more socially inhibited since COVID. I know I have. I know that I'm not the same in terms of who I was before. And I now recognize it's my nervous system that I've been attending to. So I've done a lot of work in understanding the science of the nervous system and how the body holds the score. The body bears the burden. And sometimes I think the symptoms of menopause are being, one, potentially not looked at from what's called differential diagnoses. Some women, I believe I had complex PTSD. That's what I believe I presented with in 2017. But we don't seem to be joining those dots, because if I took every single menopause symptom, which is what I've done, and I took 34, the 34 I'm going to go for, because some of them, quite frankly, are, could be multiple other things. Can they come on? I mean, who's making the list? I keep saying, is there somebody with a pen and paper that keeps writing down symptoms?
Add another one.
It's like, so if I took 34 of them, which I've done, and I cross-check every single one, which I've done, and I cross-check them with complex PTSD or trauma responses, I can tick all the boxes. If I cross-check them with nervous system dysregulation, I can tick all the boxes. And if I look at somebody who's more sensitive and somebody who's had trauma and is more sensitive, and they're having a more heightened experience, I can start saying, this is your brain and nervous system. How it's interacting, that came first, not your hormones. The hormones interact with the nervous system, don't they?
It's just exacerbating what's already there.
Yeah, it's heightening what was already part of who you were, who you are. And your story is part of who you are. I mean, you don't arrive at the perimenopause junction with no luggage, do you? And I don't think we're stopping to look at the luggage. I think, and look, a lot of that is to do with what I was doing, right? I just need to survive and I need to keep going. But I am telling you, I'm living proof of that. You will not be able to just keep going at some point your body and your nervous system is telling you, I need attention.
To stop and, listen.
Symptoms are messages from the body, aren't they? That's what symptoms are. And a lot of the symptoms are crossing over with multiple other things. And so I think we need to widen the lens really now, because if we don't widen the lens and we keep staying on this narrow path of like 3 hormones, we're not able to serve as many women, in my opinion, because this isn't about HRT. And I take HRT, so
it's just part of the bigger picture.
Well, what about women that, you know, have a diagnosis of breast cancer, and then they go through trauma, right? That's trauma. That is trauma. Yeah, it's a health diagnosis like that. It's trauma to the body, right? Then you have to go through the more trauma of, then you have the aftermath of that, where your nervous system and your brain has probably become much more sensitive and fearful of the return of that. So your nervous system then starts to become, if you're stuck in a heightened stress response, your nervous system is now dysregulated. It's not your mind, it's not your thinking as a direct result of your nervous system state. When we go into depression, so we talk about the mobilization of the nervous system, you'll find that you might go into, like I did, the more freeze state, which would be more of a depressed state, where you are immobile. You don't want to move. You want to curl up. You want to just stay still. You haven't got any energy. So these nervous system states are actually directly correlating with the states of our body and the states of our health and the states of our menopause experience. And I'm going to go so far to say that if we don't look at the body and the brain and the nervous system states, then we're just going to keep putting a patch. Some people are going to keep putting a patch over it. And that patch,
literally,
that patch isn't going to cut it, not in the long term. Now, that's not to say that I'm on HRT, right? So I'm on now a low dose. I'm thinking about coming off it altogether. And that's just my personal thing, because I just feel I want to test it. I actually want to test, because I've been on it, you know, in my experience. I'm like, right, I've come down now. I'm on 50. So I might just come down now and see what happens now that I'm in a more regulated nervous system state. What happens? How do I feel? So I'm going to do that little experiment, because that's something that I'm fascinated with. I'm fascinated with the relationship between the nervous system and the hormones, and which one's coming first, because it's bi-directional.
Do you know anyone who's doing research in these areas at the moment?
So the research on sensory processing sensitivity is an area of research itself. So that's got its own research. There's no childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences. There's research, right, on menopause and the severity of menopause symptoms, which is kind of all related to what I've just said. It's to do with your HPA axis, to do with your brain, to do with the development of your brain and your nervous system when you're very young. Not, you know, and those childhood experiences are pertinent to a lot of women, I think, because I think we're the generation that almost dismisses it. It's almost like, well, no, I just get on with it, right? Because, like, that's what you did.
Put it all in the cupboard, shut the door.
Yeah, but we keep shoving. That's what. So you got the cupboard, right? I was talking to someone earlier about this. And you get the cupboard and you keep shoving the shit in the cupboard, right? And you keep trying to close the door and trying to close the door.
So
and you don't want to go in the cupboard anymore.
Stuff.
No, you don't want to go in the cupboard, because now it's become so huge, right, that you do not want to tidy that cupboard out, because you just know it's going to take, you know? That's what I'm talking about. And it's more complex than just, oh, these hormones. It's just too complex to be just 3 hormones. And I'm just a little bit concerned that some of the narrative is too narrow.
Yeah, probably too complex even to unpack in one podcast.
It is, and that's why I'm very conscious. People's heads will be blown off. They'll be like, what?
Yeah.
So
if they want to find out more, they should follow you on Instagram. And where can they find you?
Yeah, so if you look up Mrs. Paula Rastrick, I have created resources that I'm sending out to women to start to, so the highly sensitive test, right? This is research. This is not my test, okay? This is all the stuff I've done on myself. So if I've done it all, then all I'm doing is imparting the dots that I've joined up, the adverse childhood experiences, all of that research, then collated that, then put it into more simplified terms. So, understanding the nervous system is where I'm going to go next with my social media through my own experiences. So I spoke to a woman today and we were chatting, and it's very complex. She's on lots of medication and HRT in the mix, anti-anxiety, antidepressants. Yeah. Well, that's a lot to unpack because that's a lot of medication in your brain and nervous system. And so starting the process of understanding your background and going backwards, which is what I've done, it's not an easy thing to do, but I'm going to start sharing more of the science behind that, and I'm going to simplify it so it doesn't become what I've done, which is geeky, and it becomes more palatable and more digestible, because I think it's really important.
It's fascinating. I mean, it really is, and as I think I said to you off air, I'm kind of endlessly fascinated by this sort of great spectrum of experiences that you can have people who seem to sort of go through this almost without a backwards glance, and then at the other end we've got people who find it a completely debilitating experience. So definitely so much more research that is needed.
And again, I just want to put this disclaimer in, just because maybe you have had childhood trauma and you don't have any issues with your menopause symptoms. Let's say that, right? So it's too complex. What I'm trying to say is I think we should be looking at the brain and nervous system as well as just the hormones.
The whole body.
Yes. That's kind of like in simplistic terms. And the more I start to put out there, the more I'm getting women saying to me, this makes sense for me. So if it makes sense for the women that are coming to me and saying it makes sense, then that's helping them make sense. It won't make sense for every single woman because that's impossible, and there seems to be confusion about what's classed as PMDD as well. I just want to get that clear. I'm not talking about sensitivity to hormones. I'm talking about genetic sensitivity that you come into the world as a personality trait called sensory processing sensitivity. And there is so much of it on my website. If you want to get in contact with me and understand more, I'll just send you the links and the research that I've done.
Great. Thank you, Paula. I'll make sure that we put a link to your website in the show notes, but it's thebrainbodymethod.com. And you're also very active on Instagram, so I'll pop a link to your Instagram in there as well. Thank you so much for coming along and talking to us. And I look forward to learning more.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Middling Along podcast. Do remember to subscribe to be notified when our next episode is live. And why not visit the blog at www.middlingalong.com to sign up to my newsletter as well. I do hope you enjoyed listening today. If you did, I'd be really grateful if you would consider leaving a short review, as that helps people find the podcast and helps get it noticed. Hope you can join us next time. Goodbye for now.